My name is John Passfield, and the title of this reading will be the Poetic Novel Part 2, Video 16, The Cracked Mirror of Modernity. So I will hold up the book, okay, not a printed book, not a book you can buy in a bookstore or on the internet. This is just a draft. The Poetic Novel 2, Part 2, Influences and Elements by John Passfield and Three Roses. So this is a draft, but the book is on my website at johnpassfield.ca. And if you just go to that cover and click on the icon, you can read that book. Now, an explanation of the cover. Here it is. The subtitle is Influences and Elements, as the essays in the book are about the writers who have influenced me and the elements that I've developed in my pursuit of a form for the poetic novel for our time. As for the illustration, it was Gertrude Stein who said, "A rose is a rose is a rose." There was something there about imagery that she was expressing, but she was expressing it in an image, which means that you and I have to interpret what she meant. Not so much what she meant, but what she said means to us. That's the point. That's kind of the point of this whole essay that I'm going to read. The quotations in this essay are taken from an essay by Robert Fulford, Fulford, which I found in his book, The Triumph of Narrative. I'll read 4 of 10 segments of my essay, and then I'll read a note which I wrote as I reviewed my essay for this video presentation. So number 1, here's a quote from Robert Fulford. Beginning around 1900, modernism celebrated or mourned the end of all that was certain, orderly, and purposeful in literature. In literature, modernism turned against the naturalism that had dominated the fiction of the 19th century. It taught us to look with suspicion on the idea that a straightforward narrative could tell the truth about human life. It began to favor complexity, parody, ambiguity, and ironic self-awareness. In this new atmosphere, the unreliable narrator emerged, the storyteller for the age of relativism, the age of doubt and incredulity. Now that's Robert Fulford's quotation. Here's my response to that in my words. This quotation seems to be a jumble of ideas about modernism. I don't think that complexity, parody, ambiguity, and ironic self-awareness are elements that were not present in the straightforward narrative of a fiction of the 19th century. I'm sure that they became more pronounced when people realized that the social structure, which they thought was so solid, up until about 1900 began to sway and then finally collapse with the War of 1914-1918. I personally don't believe that the straightforward narrative cannot tell the truth about human life. I would say that the modernist novels that I value contain a straightforward narrative which tells a truth about human life, but that they also contain much more. Most of these techniques or elements, complexity, parody, ambiguity, and ironic self-awareness, are the blind gropings of the prose novel to gain the effects of the poetic novel without the authors of these novels realizing that the prose novel cannot be stretched far enough to do the work of the poetic novel. I suggest that the discontinued narrative technique of the poetic novel, a technique that I have used in almost all my novels, is not the major innovation that makes for a poetic novel. What the authors of the prose novel with technical innovations didn't realize is that telling a straightforward narrative of human life is not enough to make what I would call serious literature. When I look at the best of serious literature, the Iliad and the Odyssey of Homer, the plays of Aeschylus and Sophocles, the Elizabethan Jacobean dramas of Shakespeare, I see a single similarity with the 19th century prose novel and a double similarity with the modernist novel. Now to explain. Number 1, the best of the 3 modes of writing, of presenting and reflecting on a fictional segment of human experience, all contain a straightforward narrative, a story. Now, it's going against what Fulford's saying. However, number two, the similarity between classical serious literature and the best of the modernist novel, I don't see in the 19th century prose novel. Excuse me. The literary forms which I admire and from which I have learned not only present a straightforward narrative that tells the truth about human life, they also include, this is an extra, a layer of imagery, multiple layers of imagery, which suggests not tells, much more potential meaning about the human life experience than the single truth about human life that is presented by the novels of the straightforward narrative only. Okay, number two, here's another quotation by Robert Fulford. Sometimes an unreliable narrator withholds crucial information from the reader. Just as often the narrator doesn't know the facts or doesn't grasp their meaning. So that's a quotation from Fulford. Here's my response in my words. The unreliable narrator, as suggested above, is one of the elements by which the prose novel was groping towards the shedding of the disadvantages of the prose novel and acquiring of the advantages of the poetic novel. In the prose novel with an unreliable narrator, number one, the reader is not given crucial information, is not allowed to know the facts, or is not allowed to grasp the meaning of the facts because, and here's 1A, you might say, the unreliable narrator does not have the crucial information, has not been allowed to know the facts, or has not been allowed to grasp the meaning of the facts, excuse me again, despite the fact that 1B, the author of the prose novel with an unreliable narrator does have the crucial information, knows the facts, and knows the meaning of the facts, as it is a premise of the form that the author of the 19th century novel knows everything about the meaning of the presented story. So, number one, the only difference between the prose novel with a reliable narrator and the prose novel with an unreliable narrator is in the narrator and the reader. While number two, the sameness between the prose novel with a reliable narrator and the prose novel with an unreliable narrator is in the author. In contrast, the premise of the poetic novel is that, number one, because the author does not know, that's the big difference. The author in the poetic novel doesn't know. The author in the prose novel thinks he knows. Because the author of the poetic novel does not know the meaning of life, does not assume that the logic of the current social system and or the dominant religion of the society in which he lives is the meaning of the human experience here on earth, the narrator, if there is one, does not know how to interpret the facts, and so does not tell the reader how to interpret the facts. And so the reader is left to interpret the facts, the elements, and the arrangement of the imagery of the story on his or her own. So in the prose novel, author knows, narrator doesn't know. Poetic novel, author doesn't know. Therefore, narrator doesn't know. The prose novel with a reliable narrator and the prose novel with an unreliable narrator are both the products of a society which assumes that it knows all the answers in terms of the human experience of life here on earth. It follows that the novel with an unreliable narrator sensed faintly that the prose novel premises were false and was groping for a technical means of overcoming this deficiency. It was not until the poetic novel was developed, the modernist novel, that the deficiencies of the novel form were overcome. Okay, part 3 of my essay, starting with another quotation by Robert Fulford. Jacques Derrida, the French philosopher who did as much as anyone to create a postmodern thought, teaches that there is no one valid meaning of literary work, or as he says, a text, because language floats free of an author's intentions and will be interpreted in as many ways as there are readers. Okay, that's Robert Fulford quoting Jacques Derrida. Now here's me commenting on that. I agree with Derrida completely. The idea that the novelist is essentially a lecturer who presents characters within a social system or religion and who then tells the reader by means of a fictional narrative what life is all about for that reader is completely false. When a person reads, whether a prose novel or a poetic novel, there are two major image streams which come together and interact in a way which is completely unique to that particular reader. Number one, the first image stream. First, there's the imagery of the novel, which is being read, and even a prose novel presents imagery, its characters, and its story structure. From this imagery, an individual reader will select the imagery that is pertinent to his or her life experience, whether to the reader's conscious thought or to the reader's subconscious thought. And number two, the second stream of imagery, this literary imagery will interact in ways that are unique to that particular reader with the significant imagery which has been generated by the particular and unique life experience of that individual reader. So your mind selects imagery from a novel which another mind would ignore, and vice versa. Your mind selects information from your own life which becomes imagery which no other reader can possibly know or experience. So let's go on. Now, it's possible that some images from the life experience of the reader might, until the item of literature is read, be dormant imagery. The classic example is the memories which are turned into active imagery by the Madeleine dipped in tea of Marcel in A la Recherche du Temps Perdu. The Madeleine dipped in tea is not suggested meaning, it is an image trigger which turns the latent sleeping imagery, the latent imagery of Marcel's life experience, into active imagery. In the course of the novel, the drama of Marcel's image plot, the imagery of the various time periods of Marcel's life experience interacts by juxtaposition, by parallel and contrast with the imagery of other time periods of Marcel's life experience, to create a series of potential meanings for the novel, for Marcel and for the reader. Not the same meanings, but two different meanings. In this particular novel, Marcel is in the position of a reader. Instead of the imagery of a story that Marcel is reading, juxtaposing with the imagery of his life experience, we get multiple examples of the imagery of one stage of his life experience juxtaposed with the imagery of another stage of his life experience. In a sense, Marcel is reading the imagery of his ongoing life experience, a series of his past time experiences and a series of his present time experiences. So In Search of Lost Time suggests in search of past life experience information because it can now be perceived as imagery. Life experience information which seemed to have only an informational meaning as it was being lived through can now be juxtaposed endlessly with other past and present life experience information to create imagery which generates potential meaning. But the point is the same. Marcel is unique, and so is the meaning of A la Recherche du Temps Perdu, unique to him. In turn, the imagery of the life experience of a reader of Proust's novel is unique to that reader. So the dormant imagery of that reader's life experience will interact with the imagery of Proust's novel to create a series of potential meanings which will be unique for that particular reader. So I would add to the thought that's attributed to Derrida. Okay, now Derrida's words, I'm quoting the earlier passage, there's no one valid meaning of literary work, or as he says, a text, because language floats free of an author's intentions. Now here's what I'm adding. And interacts with the life experience imagery of each reader, and will therefore, back to Derrida, be interpreted in as many ways as there are readers. Okay, so what I'm adding to Derrida, who says every reader interprets a book differently, I'm adding yes, because the imagery of the book interacts with the imagery of that reader's life experience. So I'm adding to him, not disagreeing with him. Back to me. The only thing I would add is that when I say meaning, I always mean potential meaning, in the sense that if Marcel were to review all of those images, 7 volumes of images, a year or two later, the images might well have a different meaning for him. And it follows that anyone else reading the images of Marcel's memory would find a different meaning if they were to read those images at a different time, because the imagery of their own life experience would have shifted in terms of significant imagery, insignificant imagery, latent imagery, and active imagery. The idea of a writer as a wisdom dispensing lecturer was not a premise of the serious literature of the past. It seems to have taken hold at the birth of the novel, when it seemed that the greatest thinkers in society were the lecturers in the universities. These were wise people, it seemed. Until the birth of the modernist novel, the novel was thought to be a lecture cast in narrative style, a story as an exemplum of a lecture. It's pleasing to have moved past that erroneous assumption about the role of the writer in society. Okay, the 4th section of Fulford's essay, starting with a quote from Fulford again. In the most common view of the postmodernist, narrative is a deception. The world is not a place of beginnings and endings and middle. It's a place of coherence. And when narrative arranges the world in that way in order to tell a story and reach out to an audience, narrative lies. If we insist on turning to fiction, it must be entirely self-conscious. It must constantly remind us that this is indeed fiction. So that's Fulford's comment. He takes 3 big words, deception, lies, and fiction, and makes them basically synonyms, that they all have the same meaning. Deception, lies, fiction. I'm going to make the point that fiction is not deception and is not a lie. But here it is in my words. I would say that the narrative is not a deception, but is a human construct. Even a narrative which is drawn as much as is possible from the actual life is still a human construct, because the writers made a choice to repeat the events that have happened, we can say naturally in the course of human events, in the order in which they happened. In addition, what makes it a construct is that many more events happened in the actual life than are reported in the fictional life. So a told story, even a narrative which purports to be drawn directly from human life, is a construct which has been created by a writer in an attempt to suggest meaning to a reader. However, it was only the low-level readers who thought that narratives provided meaning. And so it is only low-level thinkers who have turned against narratives upon realizing that they don't provide meaning, and have taken to saying such shallow things as that narratives are deceptions or lies. The fictional narrative has never been a lie, although it might be shallow, silly, and irrelevant to the life of the reader. What the time sequential narrative does is to show that life happens to us in a sequence which moves through time. I think that what the modernist novelists felt was that those who praised the prose novel wanted only the reassurance that their lives were tied to time, with the best lives growing to maturity, wisdom, and even prosperity as they move through time, and the worst lives of the foolish or the unfortunate not growing to maturity, wisdom, and prosperity as they move through time. I believe that the modernist novelists decided that this concept of meaning, as presented in the realist novel, was based on social goals, the goals of a particular time frame society, and had only a superficial, incidental relationship to what it was to being a human in any location in the world through any segment of recorded time. Okay, so the realist novel focused on society as the meaning of life, social goals, and so on. And the modernist novel said, no, there's something more essential about being human, which is common to all societies in all times. Back to me. And as to the comment that narrative is a deception, King Lear is not a prose novel, but it does have a sequential narrative. So what do you do with Shakespeare if you say narratives are lies? He wrote narratives, sequential narratives. He wrote plots. So if one were to ask oneself and figure out what King Lear does not, have in common with its fellow sequential narratives, then one would know what makes modernist literature different from the novels that some commentators, misguided, in my opinion, call a lie and a deception. In my opinion, the answer has nothing to do with whether the story is told as a narrative or as a non-narrative or as a discontinued narrative. So it's all a red herring, a false trail. Okay, here's a note that I wrote as I was reading my essay over. I wrote it for this video presentation. At the end of this essay by Robert Fulford, in a section which I didn't read, I respond to a quotation by a professor of literature as saying that, here's this professor's quotation, it's a rare academic critic who would say a kind word for a straightforward narrative. That's his quotation. In my essay, I explained that the modernist novelists do not reject straightforward narrative, but like the ancient writers such as Aeschylus and Sophocles, and the Renaissance writers such as Shakespeare, the modernist writers at their best employ straightforward narrative as an acknowledgement that we live our life experiences in the stream of time, and add, this is the difference, add deepening imagery as a means by which the main character attempts to explore the potential meaning of that straightforward, locked-in time life experience. So it's not that we don't live narratives and plots. We do. It's a question of what's the meaning of them. The fact that the surface of the modernist novel was broken with the interpolation of deepening imagery made for discontinued narrative, which many critics and no doubt many writers took to mean that the straightforward narrative of a 19th century realist novel had been a lie, a deception, and was better off dead. However, most people are not original thinkers, though they think themselves to be. In truth, they take their thoughts from others. It's unfortunate that most people who consider themselves to be thought leaders in any society or in any time period only have two modes of thinking. Number one, they either accept the common thought of their time as a given and feel that they are adding to that body of thought by explaining its implications, or, this is the opposite but still shallow, they reject the common thought of their time and seize on a new body of thought provided by others, which they mistakenly assume to be saying that the old body of thought is completely false. And they spend their careers promoting what they believe to be the new body of thought by explaining its implications. Well, the first is true of most people who are born into a particular time period. I once told a Christian friend that if he and I were born during the Roman Empire, we would be worshiping at the Temple of Jupiter. I assumed that he thought that he would have invented Christianity had he been born in an earlier time, right? Most people are not original thinkers. The second is an interesting phenomenon. It occurs about once every 100 years. At intervals, the literature of a time period is reviewed by a few original thinkers, and a highly complex theory of what the forms of that time period lack is presented to the thought leaders of the time. In the time period of 1890 to 1930, the few original thinkers questioned certain aspects of the 19th century narrative novel. Eliot, Pound, Conrad, Wolfe, Hemingway, and others, some of them quite theoretically articulate, and others almost theoretically mute, explored new ways of presenting the life experience of a human being as literature. Unfortunately, some of the elements of the highly complex body of thought that emerged at that time became simplistic truisms for the element in the academic community which seized on them as first principles for the new literature. From now on, these critics thought, any book which had a straightforward narrative would be seen as a lie, a deception, and would be better off dead. Hence the shallow, silly quotation by a literature professor that few of his esteemed colleagues would be willing to praise a book which presents the life experience of the human being as a straightforward narrative. Was he thinking of Jane Austen? Was he thinking of George Eliot? Was he thinking of Henry James? Was he thinking of Aeschylus and Sophocles and Shakespeare and all of those who wrote straightforward narratives? Serious literature is written by the few and is about the many, about everyone. Academic criticism, at its best, is written by the few and is understood by the few. Shallow academic criticism is written by the many is accepted as is given and promoted in turn by the many. The secrets of the modernist novel are hard to divine, as they are written in the language of imagery, which all humans employ in their subconscious minds, but which unfortunately few human beings can understand in their conscious minds. That the writings of the original thinkers of the modernist era are written in imagery, both in their fiction and in their criticism, makes it inevitable, alas, that their thoughts about literature are being trivialized and made shallow by many of those who believe themselves to be promoting their work. Well, this is my book, The Poetic Novel, Part 2, Influences and Elements. As I said before, it's not a physical book, but it is available on my website at johnpassfield.ca. So if you click on the icon and you're interested in these topics meaning all about literature, all about writing, all about books, all about novels, then have a look. So lastly, I'll just say thank you for watching this video.